All right, welcome to Bold Like a Leopard. I am, of course, Ray McCoy, writing for American Greatness, and we are pleased to have an author here. He is with Dan Bongino, the resident fact checker. Is that correct?
Majority of my time is I run Bongino Report, which is his competitor to Drudge Report. So it's probably like 60% of my time is managing that and just aggregating the news of the day, and then the other 40% is writing and editing other people's work.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's probably one of the more difficult periods right now for you guys because I know he was going through an illness. There was the whole issue with one of his other investments, Parlor, which
Right.
is, it's been through a lot of controversy, and there's, of course, the other waves of censorship. So I think we might get into some of that at the end, but of
Yeah,
course,
sure.
I am going to hold it up. I got this from Barnes and Noble. You can find the link for the book on Barnes and Noble in the description, and we're going to publish sort of a synopsis of this review with American Greatness. And we're glad to have you on here. So, getting right into it, you wrote a book concerning basically the disintegration of New York State and New York City thanks to a couple of its most recent politicians, guys that are still in office, Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio. And you began the book's first section on New York's handling of the pandemic by highlighting how Bill de Blasio's initial response to COVID-19 was incompetent to the point that it stood out even compared to other liberal mayors like London Breed, who you cited. She's the mayor of San Francisco. Do you think that, like with Cuomo, there will be revelations of information that Mayor de Blasio concealed that he knew or didn't know about the threat of the virus through February and March when they were encouraging people to go to Chinatown and Chinese restaurants? And what's the likelihood that he'll face consequences in a real investigation like they're just talking about right now with Cuomo?
There's no reason or nothing leads me to believe, he had any intel that would tell him otherwise. And, obviously it would be a tremendously stupid thing to go, tell people to go out in Chinatown during, a pandemic that originated in China at that time. But then again, it was a dumb thing to do even without that intel. It's just kind of common sense that, at a minimum, want to avoid large gatherings. And, while we're obviously no fan of lockdowns and these onerous regulations, there are certain little things you should do to be cautious and reduce your risk. And one of them, would to be not to deliberately go out during celebrations like that. Of course, all those rules went out, or were implemented after that, and then went out the door again during the Black Lives Matter protests, and seemed to kind of conveniently be forgotten. But as for consequences, well, if the data is worse than it seems, it's really bad because at a state by state level, New York is second nationwide. Only New Jersey is worse, but New York City's death toll per capita is even higher than New York. So de Blasio is actually worse than Cuomo in that regard, and I probably spend more in the chapter actually on Cuomo than de Blasio, just because of how big the nursing home scandal was and all the various defenses he's given, and I go through them one by one and show how he's just kind of talking out of his behind.
Yeah, I think it was at least something that was worth taking as a precaution at the time. I remember in February and March, I was paying attention to some of the reports because I largely listened to alternative media. And yeah, I was definitely not aware of, just how ridiculous some of these virtue signaling displays were because you did see people like in Boston, Mayor Walsh. He took the same attitude as de Blasio. I think the main difference between Boston and New York was there was no order by the governor Baker to put put COVID patients in nursing homes. But this could easily have happened in some of these other cities simply because they were trying to say, this isn't about the Chinese. We need to embrace this whole thing and make sure that nobody's being left out by this pandemic. That's the message that I got from their displays of, loyalty to Chinatown, which I'm sure the people in Chinatown didn't appreciate the spreading of the virus at the time either. in
Well,
the end.
that's the ironic thing. I mean, actually, on a demographic basis, Asians have been like the least affected by this thing. But that's because culturally, mask wearing and it seems like mask wearing isn't as effective with COVID as we saw. But like for other things and just these generally preventative measures they're just kind of used to taking. So they ended up actually doing better. But yeah, that's the irony is that De Blasio, it's probably worse in those communities than it otherwise would have been. And obviously, yes, we don't want people to. I mean, it is true there has been a rise in hate crime against Asians. But the common sense would just be okay. We have a virus we need to take seriously. Oh, and by the way, obviously, we know Asians in our country didn't do this on purpose or have any role in this at all. Therefore, be rational. But to encourage people to spread a virus to prove how not racist you are is, I think, pretty low, pretty dim.
Right. So moving on, there's other other problems that have been cropping up over that period of time since, of course, the beginning of the pandemic. Is that there were really funny interviews of Andrew Cuomo. One of the ones that you talked about was with Savannah Guthrie, has been played a lot lately. Just flattering press covers that allowed him to conceal his pernicious role in aggravating the death tolls by housing COVID patients in nursing homes. But even then, New Yorkers themselves were discussing that follow up. Because I remember this in the summer. I know people in New York, both upstate and in the city. Could the media smokescreen have been part of an effort to avoid lockdown protests in Albany of the type that happened to Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan?
Yeah, and you know what? I feel like to some extent the emphasis now on Cuomo's nursing home scandal, which came out of nowhere, it seems. We've known about this since really as it was happening, and all of a sudden in the past 2 months, everyone cares, and it was on that AG report. Like it almost feels like everyone's trying to make Cuomo the scapegoat now because it was almost all Democrats who implemented these kind of policies, and it wasn't just him. New York's our governor in New Jersey did it. Whitmer did it as well as a few others, and it almost feels like they're trying to take away attention from the rest of them and put it on a Cuomo. As for why the media played cover for him, I think it was more of an anti-Trump thing. There were contrasting narratives that Trump was doing nothing, and we were the worst nationwide in combating this thing, and none of our citizens were taking it seriously, and all that. And then they kind of use Cuomo as a counter narrative as an example of someone doing everything right. It's actually part of the reason I wrote the book is because I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, I'm I guess humble enough to realize I know nothing about epidemiology and just kind of went with what the media was saying and thought, well, I'm only hearing positive things about Cuomo, so it must be true. But let's dive into the data and see what it looks like. And it just didn't bear out reality. I cited the stats and their death toll already, and it's been that way really since the beginning. And yes, they were hit first, but there are other states that have much less favorable demographics, like Florida, which has, I think, the largest senior citizen population in the country, i.e., those the most affected. And they've been much more looser on regulations and mask mandates and all that, and have had a lower death count. And as for how do I explain that, well, it really just seemed like we really don't know that much about this virus, or whatever we think we know, we probably don't know.
Right, and I remember also that especially in the spring, people weren't aware as of yet whether the WHO statistics were valid, whether the statistics coming out of China were valid. There was a lot of skepticism about how accurate the Italian statistics were. Like they may have been a little higher than was reported, and they had to be adjusted downward later because it was, there was conjecture over the real cause of death for some of those people. So I think people can be forgiven for early mistakes and also misreporting, but not for lionizing a person and basically turning him into a savior for an entire state and awarding him an Emmy and having him go on TV with his brother every day. I think that is beyond just saying it was a simple mistake.
Yeah, and the thing is too, like all these new, quote unquote bombshell revelations, like the AG report finding that he understated deaths by 50%. I mean, I had that in my book. I wrote that part in August where I was looking at how they were calculating nursing home deaths differently. If someone was contracted the virus in a nursing home, then went to a hospital and died, they weren't counting that. And I have estimates there of it's probably about and it's obviously the numbers back in August were different than they are today, but it was a roughly similar percentage off. So this is just a repeat of knowledge that sort of alternative media already figured out more than 6 months ago, and now it's being confirmed. But obviously, it's after Trump left office that all this gets confirmed.
Yeah, and I think that beyond just the pandemic itself, because I know that you wrote two other parts of the book that have less to do with COVID. I actually, because, if you know people who've lived in the state and have followed Cuomo for a while, and de Blasio, of course, it's not as if the state went into the pandemic in this pristine condition. It's been in horrible conditions. As you pointed out on page 70, upstate New York has technically never recovered from the job losses and blight caused by the Great Recession. And there have even been proposals at various junctures to split up New York into 2 or even 3 states between upstate New York City, and Long Island. And now that such similar separatist movements have happened in western states like Oregon, what do you think are the chances of it happening in New York?
That's the thing. I mean, I don't know if it'll actually ever happen in this country, but I actually do think it would be one way of healing the national divide. Like everyone's always talking about like secession or like people forming their own enclaves, and like the fact of the matter is that will never work. Like even in a deep red state, there are still going to be areas where there are a lot of Democrats, and even in California, there are Republican havens. So breaking up individual states to make them like a liberal Mecca or a right wing Mecca, I don't think would work. But there is an obvious urban-rural divide. If you look at in most presidential elections, Illinois, how Illinois votes, almost every single county, in fact, it's usually every single county except where Chicago is located, votes Republican, and then only Chicago is Democrat, and that's enough to make it a blue state. If you broke that up and you had more like a city-state model, I think it would work. But will that actually ever happen? I unfortunately don't think so.
Yeah, I actually like almost every state. I live in Ohio, and it's like most of the blue support, especially now that Trump, he's been through 2 elections, is located in I think 4 cities: in Toledo, in Cleveland slash Akron, and in Columbus, and in Cincinnati. And I think that's something that's worth really observing. How do we really create less of a partisan divide between rural and urban? Because every single state has that problem, especially if you go to states where you mentioned Illinois, where there's one dominant metropolis and then there's this whole sea of red around it. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about this, and I don't want it to overshadow the rest of the conversation, but as of today, 6 women have now accused Governor Cuomo of varying degrees of inappropriate sexual behavior. And I remember in 2018, he was challenged in the primary by Cynthia Nixon, who's known as an actress from Sex and the City, and Cuomo just obliterated her. And it was a battle between the traditional Democratic machine. Cuomo, of course, is a legacy. His dad was governor. And the woke base, because Cynthia Nixon is LGBT. She was talking a lot about the same sort of platform as the Justice Democrats. In some ways, de Blasio is a symbol of the woke side, and Cuomo of the old school Democrats. Do you think if Cuomo succumbs to the current scandal, there could be a total woke takeover in New York State?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like Cuomo's a more Frank Underwood character, while de Blasio is the ideologue. That is the sad thing is if, a lot of Democrats are calling for Cuomo's removal, but yeah, it is the woke crowd. It is the far, far left. And, would I rather have the grandma killer or them? It's a tough call, I suppose. And that's the thing about a state like New York. Like, yes, it is theoretically possible a Republican could become governor. In fact, we see Republicans become governors of blue states all the time. Like, Vermont is the most liberal state in the union, and they have a Republican governor. But it's, not the kind of Republican that you and I would be, that happy with. It's going to be a liberal Republican. So, that's a tough thing about, politics in those kinds of states is that, your best bet is, someone who's kind of a rhino, but is a bulwark against the left's craziest factions. As for how this will play out, Cuomo is obviously refusing to resign. But this is, actually both scandals. He could face consequences. He has retained a lawyer for this, and it was a lawyer who defended Harvey Weinstein. So this is something that's being taken seriously. And, ironically, Cuomo signed a law 2 years ago that lowered the threshold for what counts as sexual harassment. Effectively, a woman just has to reasonably be uncomfortable, and that can count. And it would be ironic if that law is what ends up tanking him. And then on the nursing home front, the cover-up, I think, is going to become the crime. Unfortunately, crummy policy isn't a crime, but we do know from one of Cuomo's aides that they were deliberately hiding the nursing home toll because they didn't want Trump's DOJ to investigate them. Now, preemptively hiding data in anticipation of a potential investigation could, some argue, count as obstruction of justice, so they could face consequences there. But on the other hand, and this is, I guess, the black pill, is that it's all contingent on Biden's DOJ doing the right thing. So, how likely is that?
Yeah, and I think one of the real critical things that isn't being mentioned right now is that, well, Cuomo, he was attorney general before he was governor. The previous governor stepped down or one of the previous governors, not the immediate one. Elliot Spitzer stepped down because of a prostitution scandal. The other attorney general who came after Cuomo, Eric Schneiderman, also stepped down for serious Me Too allegations that I don't remember what happened afterward. So it would seem in order to be attorney general of New York, up until now, you had to be some sort of secret creep.
Yeah.
And ironically, now they have Letitia James. Here's wishing her luck. She'll break the streak. But I think it's just breathtaking how the people who end up being these just egregious abusers, allegedly, they happen to be the ones who are supposed to enforce the law. Sometimes they toughen up the law. Do you think there will ever be some sort of reckoning in terms of of broader society, the media, that simply you shouldn't paint someone as guilty until there's actually a process, an adversarial process in place?
Well, they do realize it selectively. Cuomo was among those who crucified Kavanaugh when he faced allegations that we still have not a single shred of evidence for, and yet the second he's accused, let's wait for the evidence to come in. And I think it's kind of bipartisan, that attitude of when it's your side, you got to wait for the facts. When it's the other side, you just go after them. But the thing is, will the media ever improve on that if you're consistent? Unfortunately, no. I've noticed I'd say there's two forms of politics. There's the kind that you and I do, where we talk about, policies that affect people and dissect them. But then there's sort of the normie end of politics that I think probably 80 or 90% of the population is in tune with, and that's the soap opera version of politics. It's who said what about who scolded who on Twitter, it's more high school politics almost, and you sort of see that play out on Twitter when people have fantasies about Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and all this bizarre stuff we read there. So that, unfortunately, that is to the mass market for politics, is that kind of thinking and making celebrities out of these people, and it's I don't think healthy for the country. But no, I don't think the media will ever learn.
Yeah, I think it's one of the big frustrations of mine because, there was the 4 years of Donald Trump. Obviously, you brought up Kavanaugh, and people were cheering on Trump when he selected Kavanaugh. And then I heard a few people talking about how his role in the Patriot Act, actually, crafting the Patriot Act, that was one of the most unconstitutional overreaches that there were. And because Trump had selected him, a lot of people on the Republican side were unwilling to really criticize him and say this might be just a regression to the Bush era. Right. And then all the Me Too stuff overshadowed that. And most of that was very shaky or I should say almost impossible to prove. In fact, most of them were ultimately never proven. I don't know if there was.
It got to the point where there was one person who accused Kavanaugh via postcard, and then within a day, the media for some reason ran with it, then retracted it within a day. The bar was on the floor. And the thing about Cuomo too is if somebody takes him down, it will be the sexual harassment. But and obviously they're both horrible scandals. But of the two, the nursing home one's way worse. I mean, 15,000 people died in nursing homes. I think that's the worst scandal. Obviously I would want him to go down for either, and hopefully both. But it is now overshadowing the way worse scandal.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to just focus on Cuomo because you wrote about de Blasio as well. Yeah. His mismanagement, which has somewhat to do with the pandemic, but there's also the issue of the way that he uses the city resources for his own family, which you touched on in regards to his son and his daughter. You did go through the whole law enforcement issue where he was, at the same time as he was being personally guarded by NYPD protective details, he was just bashing on the department as a whole. And another thing that, I didn't really see you highlighting it, but I remember his management of the New York City Housing Authority. And that really woke me up to how awful the public housing crisis is in the U.S. So we have this gargantuan bureaucracy, all of these resources poured into housing for the poorest Americans, and the people managing them are basically on autopilot, and you have these waiting lists that are just miles and miles long. I could probably share some of the stuff I've written about it with you later, but that's really the unmentioned penalty of electing and reelecting De Blasio. He basically has just pulverized the poorest people in New York City. Many of them are the people of color that he all the time he just harps on. Oh, I want to make it a city that's not a tale of two cities. I want it to be one New York and everything. And talking
And
about
the whole people of color quote gets changed when I don't know why Democrats say people of color when they mean blacks and Hispanics, because I talk about it a lot in charter schools, and De Blasio is crusading against them, and anything where even Asians are successful. So why are you saying people of color when obviously Asians are people of color? It's this bizarre vision that we're going to have equal outcomes in an unequal world, which is never going to happen.
Yeah, and especially when you think about New York City, it is, and I've been there several times over the past few months for work. Um, it's like really it is the city of immigrants, but it shows like how awful it can be to be an immigrant. You have a lot of these people. Like I remember seeing elderly Asian women having to drag suitcases through the subway, through and it's pretty it's pretty neglected in terms of cleanliness and everything. I've seen that, of course, there's a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe there that are living in pretty squalid conditions, just like the so-called immigrants of color. And it shows just how Orwellian his thinking is, because I remember reading last year about his superintendent of schools, Carranza, and how he was just taking this battering ram of critical race theory, not just against the students by eliminating the standardized testing and the standards for admission to the elite schools, but also by doing these witch hunts against some of the staff who he said were not diverse enough. What do you think happens with that sort of policy once de Blasio leaves? We don't know who the next mayor will be. I think the election is this November, but is any of it reversible, and do you think it will be reversed?
I actually am more optimistic on that. I mean, actually, and it's sort of just owed to the fact that everyone in New York City is a Democrat, but all the people there that are pro-school choice and all the crusaders that are Democrats, and obviously it's mainly because there aren't very many Republicans out there. But there are people on the left that do support it, and it is the thing is school choice is a bipartisan issue, except for, among parents. So there will be pressure there. And obviously Asians are a major voting bloc there, so and they're going to be the most in favor of it. In fact, too, I mean, I don't even think most blacks and Hispanic families are would be against a gifted and talented program existing, even if their kids aren't in it. It's just, it really, honestly doesn't make any sense to me. But you just have to have this weird liberal vision of what you think equality is to even think that's a reasonable idea.
Yeah, I think what worries me the most, and people have talked about it. I know Dan Bongino's talked about it because I listen to his podcast pretty frequently. That there's this out migration. There are people from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut moving here to Ohio. I know there's a ton of them moving to Florida. Do you personally have a perspective? Do you think attitudes will change among the people moving to these new states, or do you think that this neurosis is going to be exported to a neighborhood near you?
So, this is actually a long-standing trend, and the pandemic just exacerbated it. I think in large part because the work from home opportunities made a lot of people realize, like, well, actually, I can move it. It's, it's sort of a compounding effect. Like, the only reason I haven't left New Jersey is because my parents live here. If they moved to Florida, I'd probably move to Florida as well. There was an article published by Heritage probably 5 or 6 years ago, and they pointed out at the time, in the years leading up to their article, about 1,000 people on net basis were leaving blue states or red states. So it's a trend nationwide, and California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York are the big losers. Last year, New York State was actually the biggest loser, and then New York City lost about 500,000 people. And Florida so far is the number one destination of those leaving New York. And in the book, I actually do a walkthrough of what is life like fiscally, or what is the scope of government in life in New York versus Florida. And basically New York's government per capita is twice as big as Florida's, and so therefore you're paying twice as much as in taxes. And I just walk through the results of what you get for it, and it's usually, Florida does better. There are a few cases where, on a few, parameters where New York's a little bit better, like, maybe their poverty rates 1% lower than Florida's, but relative to what they're spending, it's negligible. So the question is just why spend double when you can get better weather and the same services for half?
Yeah, and I think about it too because I have certain people I know that moved to New York when it was getting better. It did get better, of course, under Bloomberg, and you talked a little bit more about the Giuliani era.
Yeah.
Um, as far as the policing issue, so I think it's pretty hard to make a case that de Blasio's attitude to criminal justice really makes any sense.
Correct. And the
But
thing is, too, go ahead.
yeah, I wanted to ask though, it was sort of it grew out of that stop and frisk issue that was highlighted a lot under Bloomberg. I think that many of the city's residents, at least the ones who do vote, started to look at it and say, well, why are we basically having people stopped so frequently?
Yeah.
And, there were all sorts of statistical correlations that were being highlighted. And that did start, of course, under Giuliani, and then Bloomberg, I think, put it into hyperdrive.
Yep.
What do you think is a way to balance it out so that you do have accountability for violent offenders and even some of these petty crimes that do impact quality of life, but also make it clear to the average citizen that this is ultimately for the better, and you're not just going to be stopped arbitrarily and have your personal freedoms violated?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I mean, the logic between why, or illogic, I should say, why de Blasio got rid of stop and frisk didn't even have to do with whether or not it worked. It was always, it was always a racial justice issue, and he argued, well, 90% of people are being stopped are black or Hispanic. Those demographics are, I don't know what percent of the city, let's just say half, therefore they're overrepresented. But the thing with stop and frisk is it was to catch people who matched descriptions of suspects, and 90% of the suspects in New York City are black or Hispanic, so it perfectly matched that, which is the only relevant detail, yet it got removed. Now, on the bright side, I mean, the evidence of stop and frisk efficacy is sort of weak. I mean, I think I would err on the side of caution and keep it because I did find some evidence that it worked, but it wasn't like overwhelming. We need this or the city's screwed. But the bigger problem with de Blasio is the relationship a mayor has with his police force does make a difference. And I think I even have a timeline in the book of just, the bickering between the two of them and how demoralized his actions made them. And that does play into it and have an impact on your everyday behavior as a police officer. There was some viral videos recently or a few months ago of people like throwing water at police officers. And obviously in any other situation, those people would have been arrested, but the cop just kind of took it and fled the scene. And that's more or less how you act when you know a mayor won't have your side. If you're a cop, you are going to be in spots where you, in a split second, have to use force. And you're putting cops in a situation where they don't even have to consider, is my life in danger? They have to consider how is the public going to react to this, and will the mayor have my side, even if I'm right? I mean, in 90% of these police brutality cases, we end up finding out they're more or less justified. And a lot of cops have to realize that the narrative that's going to be painted about them is going to be more important to the public than reality.
Right, and I think it's been a big struggle of late for people who consider themselves conservative to reconcile their traditional respect for law enforcement to some of the tyrannical abuses that you see. You see police officers and sheriff's deputies and various other legal authorities coming and penalizing bar owners, penalizing people running their small business, arresting people for going to the beach, and I've never been one of the, what do you call them, the Blue Lives Matter people. I always think you should have proper civil rights for the accused, and you should give adequate training for law enforcement. Going forward, do you think that this will continue to be a fault line between conservatives and liberals, both on the national level and in New York City? Because you do have a lot of people in New York they traditionally vote Democrat, but they don't want to see their storefront just getting, just trashed all the time.
Do you mean to defund the police issue as a whole, or?
Yeah, but both the defunding the police and also the easy, what do you call it, the bail reform issue that you actually talked about a lot in I believe the third section.
Yeah, they ended up like really. Yes, that was the thing, and they passed bail reform, and we, we're of course told, oh, if you're a murderer, it's obviously not going to affect them. And what do you know? Accused murder. There were examples of accused murderers getting off thanks to bail reform. I mean, obviously they were going to be brought back later and all that, but why, why take the risk? Um, the thing with the defund the police is it's an issue that's popular among the most far left people on the left. Like the quote unquote Twitter left represents. There have been studies on this. The 10% most liberal people that are on the left or leftists, whatever you want to call them. And it seems that only about 20% of the U.S. population actually supports defund the police. Now, when you phrase defund the police as freeing up resources for social workers and all that jazz, it becomes a bit more popular. But the fact of the matter is, people are treating municipal finance like it's a Mexican standoff between police and everything else. There are plenty of cities where police are funded just as well as mental health services and healthcare and all these other things. It's sort of a false narrative. And even with social workers, I mean, there are going to be situations where you need a social worker and a police officer. Obviously, I would prefer the government not to spend more of my money, but the argument is for more spending in that regard, not cut the police. Not NYPD officers start out making $42,000 a year. If you think cutting their salary is going to make them less violent towards black people, I really don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I think personally, this is one of the areas where it pushes me away from either camp, because I believe if you want to have a less punitive justice system, if people are diagnosed for an addiction, you sentence them to treatment. And of course, it should be a clinical diagnosis. I don't believe in the death penalty. I think that would place me certainly in the liberal part of the spectrum, but I'm also very much pro-life. And we've seen in New York, there's all this new legislation that extends the period where an abortion can be performed. This was under Cuomo, by the way. I think it was up till birth, and there was actually a case where a man uh, he battered his pregnant wife and killed the fetus. I don't know if she survived, but it was no. Actually, I believe they both were killed, and it was treated as a single murder.
Oh,
Um, do you think that when you go through New York City, there's a lot of churches, there's a lot of people who are very devout, especially Catholics over there. And do you think that one of these issues, the pro-life issue or something like that, could lead to a different political movement in New York because people are going to say, yeah, I do believe in a more generous safety net, but I don't want to see this violation of my personal beliefs.
Uh, I don't know how if you were to have the average voter list their top 20 issues, I don't know where abortion would be on there. I do think when it comes to decision making and where you live and who you vote, it's more sort of direct things to you like taxes and spending and police and all that, and is a trash can taken out. So I'm not quite sure, but yeah, I mean, obviously there is, among more religious voters, it is going to be a significant issue, and it could just be another reason for them to either vote against them or flee the state, as many others are doing.
Okay, and I guess the last question, of course, it relates more to day to day you work with Dan Bongino and his Bongino report. He's been taking a lot of financial risks, investing in these new tech platforms and specifically Parler and Rumble.
Rumble.
I'm a big fan of alt tech. His two platforms, I've had like mixed experience with it. Not particularly thrilled, but I still use them because I believe in moving away from traditional technology. So, as somebody who's a content creator, what do you think are going to be the tipping points that will allow those to finally reach Americans as a whole, as opposed to just people who are within a certain ideological niche?
Well, it seems like censorship is just, is ironically pushing more people towards us. I think Parler's biggest jump was when he got banned from Twitter. Obviously, big tech intervened and got knocked him offline for a month. But it is generally whenever there's like routine purges on Twitter of followers that Parler seems to see a jump. And censorship is getting more and more ridiculous. Like I think Disney, like the Dr. Seuss story was the absurd quote unquote cancel culture story of the week and a few days ago. Now they're like Disney is banning Dumbo and a few other children's movies. Like, it's just that's just a random example. Obviously, it's not really a big tech example, but just the things that are getting censored is just getting increasingly absurd. And I think people are going to want a refuge. Ironically, Facebook has the most conservative demographics of any site. It's just this, the platform isn't quite as friendly to conservatives. But what else? I also think there's an opportunity too. Like, it's that good. All right. Okay, sorry, but I think I got muted by accident. I was going to say, like, I think the next big thing too is finance. There are people getting banned, like conservatives, or admittedly, it is people that are more far right, getting banned from like payment processors and their credit card company, or their bank. And I think there are certain services where you really should not be able to refuse service. Like, I don't think your utility company should be able to turn off your power because you think wrong. Now, and I see that as different from the bake the cake issue because there's not really a shortage of bakers in this country. So we do need an alternative infrastructure and a parallel economy. And we got video, we got our own Twitter with Parler, we have our own video with Rumble, but we really need to mimic everything else as well. Yeah, it's a good book. Yeah, yeah, it did Spygate. No, no, I still have to, I'm Spygate. It was so much. Like, it was the most research I think I've ever done for a book. So it's kind of burnt out from that one, and was doing other work for Dan at the time. So I was like, I'll just continue writing for your site, but you can, go solo on that one. Um, yeah, that's the thing, I mean, Trump was president. We had all these people who spied on him, and they faced no consequences. When he's president, it was his FBI, his DOJ. So now, granted, the swamp, it was a bit swampy under Trump with a lot of the people running the show, and he didn't have full control over those agencies. But I think Biden is an establishment candidate. All those people are the establishment, and no, I don't really think there's going to be any consequences there. And even with the Spygate, we're now learning the Durham report. We might not even be released to the public. So it's it's just hard to be optimistic. Cool. Well, it seems to be good for their sales, so I'm actually pro canceling my book. Oh, I was at the mall the other day. I was getting some new shirts. I did walk into a bookstore to deliberately move my books next to his, so I got a minor win in that regard. But I agree it should be that way nationwide. Oh, yeah. I don't understand why she's famous. I still just don't understand, but I guess anyone can be nowadays. Sounds good. All right, sounds good, man. Yeah, I look forward to seeing it.